I first learned of Kitty Genovese in my sociology class in college, and I later learned that her case has been told repeatedly in sociology classes for the last 50 years. She was a 28-year-old girl from Queens, New York, who was a bar manager. And in 1964, she finished her shift and went home. And she encountered a crazy man. She parked in the Long Island Railway parking, which was 100 feet from her apartment door, and the man started stabbing her. He stabbed her for the only reason he's ever come up with is, "I just wanted to kill a woman." And when they asked him why he wanted to kill a woman, he said, "Because they're weaker and they put up less of a fight." She screamed for help, and various people heard her, and the man ran. And as she was bleeding, no one came to help, and so he came back and finished his work. The story didn't make any news in the New York papers at the time because no one really cares much about a 28-year-old barmaid in Queens, New York. Sometime later, the story broke out because the chief of police told the editor of the Times about it. When he printed the article, the headline read that 36 witnesses stood and did nothing while the young girl was murdered. 36 people. And it's taught in sociology classes in what's called bystander theory, which the theory proposed by Darley and Latani is just simply that when you need help, sometimes having more is less. Because what they later discovered, there weren't actually 36 witnesses. When they went through the original list, there were probably 49, but most of them didn't know what was going on. It's Queens, New York, and people scream in the middle of the night constantly in 1964. But the ones that did kind of know what was going on just all assumed somebody else would help. And so they teach you, if you're ever in trouble on the side of the road, if you look at one person in the eye and ask them to help you, you do a lot better than if you're in a room of 100 people and scream help. I don't know why that is, but I found it to be true. This week I got an email from the East Tennessee Regional Leadership Association, and they were asking about addresses of people in Granger County. And I was going to respond. They wanted to ask them to events and keep them informed of what was going on. And I thought about doing the research, which would not have been that hard, and then I realized that the email had been sent to 14 other people in Granger County. And instinctively, I deprioritized that email. Because, well, other people can do that work. Frankly, the guy that wrote the letter can do that work. It's not that difficult with the internet the way it is. When you just call out for one person, you're usually better off. I found this in church work. If I said right now, "I need volunteers to help with McElhaney Gardens," you may or may not respond. But if I ask you individually, you do a lot better. I don't know if it's our egos or what, but we like to be the person that's asked. And it means more if we know there's nobody backup to do that other work. Well, if I'm the only person that's being asked, this may not get done if I don't do it. But what happens when that one person that you want help from is God? And God doesn't seem to answer. And God doesn't seem to care. That's what I was asked to preach on. Is how do we handle it when God doesn't seem to really care about us? And when God seems distant? So I picked a text in Mark chapter 6, verses 45 to 52. It's page 851 of your Key Bibles. This is just after the feeding of the 5,000, which is very important. The feeding of the 5,000 is the only miracle of Jesus that's in all four Gospels in the Bible. And Jesus takes loaves and fish. John tells us from a small boy and feeds an entire crowd. And evidently Jesus is tired, just wants time alone because he sends the disciples away and he says, "I'll meet you." And that's where our story begins. Immediately he made his disciples get into the boat and go ahead of him to the other side, to Bethsaida, where he dismissed the crowd. After he said goodbye to them, he went away to the mountain to pray. When evening came, the boat was in the middle of the sea, and he was alone on the land. He saw them being battered as they rowed because the wind was against them. Around 3 a.m, he came toward them walking on the sea and wanted to pass by them. When they saw him walking on the sea, they thought it was a ghost and cried out. But they all saw him and were terrified. Immediately he spoke with them and said, "Have courage, it is I. Don't be afraid." Then he got into the boat with them and the wind ceased. They were completely astounded because they had not understood the loaves. Instead, their hearts were hardened. The text starts off with the word immediately. Mark is the Gospel of Action. It's Reader's Digest version. Everything is packed in. Jesus is on the move. It's Jesus as the Energizer Bunny. Mark's most favorite word that's not used in many of the other Gospels is uthus in Greek, which means immediately. It's how he transitioned. Immediately after the feeding 5,000, he's off to do something else. Jesus is constantly on the move in Mark. Some people call it the Gospel of Action. And he instructed his disciples, get in the boat and go to the other side. And so while he's doing that, he's dismissing the crowd. I don't know how Jesus dismissed the crowd, but in my mind, when I hear this story, I hear Jesus telling 5,000 men, plus all the women and children there, you don't have to go home, but you can't stay here. I don't know how he dismissed them, but somehow he says, it's time to go. He says goodbye to them. He goes away to the mountain to pray. And I think this is very important. Anytime Jesus does something very public, he goes off to the mountain to pray. I view this because of me and my generation. Many of you know this. You don't see me very often without my cell phone. It's just part of me at this point. But there's almost no night that I don't plug in that cell phone. Because if I don't plug in that cell phone, it's going to be dead the next day. I think he constantly, in these big situations where he's being Jesus, he constantly has to go back and talk to God because that's the source of his power. He's recharging. Martin Luther once said, I'm just too busy to not pray at least 4 hours a day. And that's an interesting statement. It goes against what we're taught in this country. Prayer was the source of the energy for this man, and he knew that. He never was too busy not to pray. Prayer was the source of what was going on. So when evening comes, the boat's in the middle of the sea, and Jesus is on the land. He sees them being battered as they rowed because the wind is against them. And so we're viewing this from Jesus' perspective, which is the narrator steps in and we get to see what Jesus sees, which is very rare. He's standing on the shore. It's the middle of the night. The actual Greek is during the fourth watch. The Romans divided the nights into 4 watches, from 9 to midnight, 6 to 9, 9 to midnight, midnight to 3, and 3 to 6. This is the last time. 3 to 6 in the morning. They worked all day trying to row this boat. I mean, I don't know if you can imagine, they've already had a hard work day. Now they're on a boat trying to row against the wind, and it's between 3 and 6 in the morning. I can't imagine how tired these people are. And this is the scene that Jesus sees from the side of the water, or of the lake. And this is where the text gets interesting, because this story is in Matthew and this story is in John, but Mark alone includes this statement. When Jesus sees this, he wants to pass them by. And that goes against everything we think Jesus would do in this situation. Jesus sees his best friends in the world, his disciples, tired as all get out and struggling in the middle of the lake. And his immediate instinct is, I'm going to pass by them. He seems like he doesn't really care that much. And we'll have to figure out what to do with that. Just so you know, it was probably a serious situation. They're not probably a life-threatening situation, but if you've ever been to the Sea of Galilee or heard about the Sea of Galilee, the weather can change on a dime. These are experienced fishermen, but there was no way to know when this would come. So they get caught out in the storm, and when they see him, we finally switch perspective. Now we're thinking about the disciples. They think it's a ghost. The Greek is phantasma, where we get the word phantom. They think it's a phantom out there, and so they cry out, which to me is a natural reaction. I don't know that I would immediately think it was a ghost, but if I'm out in the middle of the night from 3 to 6 in the morning, I'm already tired, it's pitch dark, and I see some guy walking on the water, I'm going to give them permission to be a little freaked out by this scene. They saw him and they were terrified. And once again, immediately, boom, Jesus immediately gets into action. He spoke with them and said, have courage, it is I, don't be afraid. So then he gets into the boat with them, and the wind stops. And they were completely astounded because they had not understood about the loaves. Instead, their hearts were hardened. And the way the story is written, we're supposed to think, why didn't they know it was him? I mean, they're with him all the time. If you saw your best friend in the world that you see 24/7 and you're living with, you probably ought to recognize him. And maybe if the guy just fed 5,000 men, not counting women and children, with just a few loaves and fish, maybe you shouldn't be too shocked that he's out there just jogging on the water. I don't know. What I do know is that I am troubled by the fact that he wanted to pass them by. When he sees his friend struggling, what is going on here? I think my favorite interpretation of this, when I read this, I've thought a lot about this, and sometimes I think about what it would be like to be the disciples, and I understand them. I understand completely getting terrified by somebody walking on the water and maybe thinking it's a ghost. Which there were all kinds of mythologies of that day, particularly if you were sailors. There's still sailor stories where mythological sea creatures, they would have known these stories and think, maybe it's a Loch Ness Monster. I mean, they wouldn't have used the Loch Ness Monster, but they would have had a similar equivalent. I understand the disciples, but when I try to picture what would I do if I was Jesus in this situation, I was really pleased that I'm not the only person in history that's thought about this. But when I put myself in the role of Jesus, this is what I'm thinking. I think, there's my friends out there. And if I saw my friend struggling, and it was really easy, like it's effortless for me to walk on the water, I'd joke with them. I'd just sprint up next to them. I think it'd be very funny. I find humor in this. That Jesus is just going to walk by them, drive by them. I don't know if you've ever seen your friend on the interstate. I don't know if you've ever done this. And you're like, oh, drive by. This is a joke. Honk the horn. Let them know you're there. I don't know what he's doing there. That's probably not it. That's probably not his only thing. But I do think it's worth thinking. Was Jesus ever joking or funny? And if you don't think Jesus joked, why don't you? Because there's a lot of stories that in the ancient world, they thought Jesus was funny. And I can tell you that kids would not have loved Jesus if he was constantly stoic and just saying these great sayings all the time. I think he had a great personality. But I do think part of him wanted to get to the other side first. I don't know if it's his primary reason, but they're not ready for this. They're in the lead and it doesn't make sense. The way the gospel is structured, it just doesn't work. This is the best illustration I can give you. Now, if I'm preaching my sermon, and I go and I decide that I want to sit by Chelsea, because I'll hear about this later, if I start preaching from here and talking to you, it doesn't feel right. Because I've never done that before, and the preacher sitting in the congregation, it doesn't work. It's wrong. You may not know why it's wrong, but it doesn't feel wrong. Part of it's wrong because you can't see me, and one person gets special treatment. In the Gospels, Jesus is always ahead of the disciples. He's the leader, and they're the followers. And it doesn't feel right when they're out in the lead. I think that's part of the story. I don't know that it's his main reason, but I think it's worth considering. In your life, are you leading the way? Where is Jesus? Well, tags on cars. God is my co-pilot. Never liked that because God should be probably the pilot. I mean, the car I'm not really concerned with, but of your life. Who's making the plays? Who's calling these plays? Who is in charge? Not once in this story, through the first 6 chapters of Mark, have the disciples ever been in the lead. Jesus is always the one picking where to go and what to do, and it seems very odd that they're out there without him. And so maybe that's part of it. Maybe it's kind of a trial run, and they've proven, metaphorically, they're not ready for this. They're not ready to take the oars themselves. They're struggling. I don't know that that's the main reason. I can't imagine that's the main reason for Jesus saying, well, I need to be in the lead, because you still got the disciples struggling. Struggling at the oars. The most common view of scholars is this is what's called a theophany. And one scholar named Heil, H-E-I-L, says that it is the language passed by is almost technical jargon. Now I'll go back and explain this more. In the Old Testament, in Exodus 33, Moses is talking to God, and it's very important to Moses that he sees God. And in the Old Testament, the belief was if you saw God, you would drop dead on the spot. Moses knows this and God knows this, and so what happens is God tells Moses, I will pass by you. So God essentially puts the equivalent of God's hand on Moses and walks by and passes by Moses, and he sees the backside of God and walks away. A similar thing happens to Elijah. It's God passing by. And so the train of thought is that Jesus is passing by the disciples so that he can show them that God is in him and he is in God. That's what the pass by means. It's a technical terminology. The reason I had Doug read Job 9 today is in Job 9 and 11, the one thing that is attributed to God is the ability to walk on water in Job 9:8. Because only God can walk on water. Chris Angel, I guess, had not done that yet. But realistically, God alone can walk on water. And then in Job 9:11 it says, and when he passes me, I did not know him. And there's this connection that Jesus is showing them. It's a teachable moment. Jesus is showing them he's God. He's trying to teach them a lesson as they're struggling. And I like that. And most scholars today, that's their answer to this question. This is Jesus showing that he's God. I mean, I can't walk on water. I don't know all of you. I haven't seen all of you in the lake, but I'm pretty sure you can't walk on water. And so there's no doubt in my mind that this is a miracle and Jesus is walking on the water, and it's to show his divinity here. But my problem with that is that they're struggling at this time. And any other time, it seems like there's what's called these theophanies, where God shows God's self to the world. People are usually in a private place, and they're calmer. It's a calm, serene setting. It's one-on-one. It's private. This is a very public setting, and these guys, it's 3 to 6 in the morning, and they've been out all day, and they're tired. And I don't know. I don't know if they can be expected to take all this in at this time. I do think Jesus is showing them he's God. I just don't know if that's the main thing he's trying to teach them here. But it's a really good theory. I do think part of it is a trial run for later. One of the most common theories in the early part of the 20th century was that Mark is telling you what the disciples thought here. It seemed, from their point of view, that Jesus was going to pass them by. And that makes sense. I'm sure it did seem like Jesus wanted to pass them by. And that's actually a word in Greek is thelo, which is Greek 101, is that means he wishes or desires to pass them by. And I'm sure it seemed that way, but the reason I think it seemed that way is because that's probably what he was doing. The Greek actually said he wanted to pass them by. It doesn't say the disciples thought he wanted to pass them by. It'd be a lot easier if that was what it said. It's not what it says. I think that's the key, though. They're out there struggling on the water, and it's not a good time. And they see Jesus, and he walks by, and it matters what they think. I think that's the point. What would you think? If you're out there, it's been a long, awful day. I can't imagine they're in a good mood. I don't know if you've ever had one of those days where you've worked all day, and the only thing you want to do is get home, and then something breaks down. And it's the last thing you want to deal with. I always relate this to my dad's reputation in my house growing up. My father had this great reputation in the community because he was such a hard worker, and he never missed any meetings ever that I can remember, and he always worked 60 to 8-hour weeks. My mother and I would always say, why is he never here when we need him? Which meant something just broke down that only my dad could fix, and he wasn't there, and we were panicking. And the reason why this happened was because if something broke down when my dad was there was no emergency because he would just fix it. It just always seemed like he wasn't there when we needed him. Because, well, when he was there, there was no reason to panic. And he was there most of the time. My dad may have worked 60 to 80 hours every week of my life, and he may have done every community service. I don't think my dad ever missed any one of my events growing up, or my mother's projects. I don't ever remember him missing anything. But we always would say, why is he never here? He's always at work. No, he wasn't always at work. It's one of those moments here, though. What do they think when they see Jesus? I wonder if they think, why is he always doing crazy stuff like walking on the water and all I need is in this boat rowing with me? Or he's already calmed the storm in Mark 4. Why can't he just make it that easy for us now? What are they thinking about Jesus here? I think it's the only question that matters. And it's the only thing the text doesn't tell us. Mark's hard on them. They were completely astounded because they had not understood about the loaves. Instead, their hearts were hardened. They don't ever consider that it could be Jesus out there. And maybe Jesus is just doing what Jesus does, which is being God. And they come down hard on him. They had not understood about the loaves. They had not understood Jesus. I think I read every major biblical commentary of the last 150 years this week about this passage. And every time they talked about what it meant for Jesus to pass them by, they used words like bizarre and intriguing and interesting. And they did that because not one of them knew for sure what he was thinking. We got good guesses, a lot of good theories. Maybe he is out there joking, playful with the disciples because they're not in mortal danger. Maybe he's out there and they just failed the test because they're just not ready to assume the lead. And maybe he's just trying to compensate for that and reassume his position atop the hierarchy. Maybe, most likely, he's shown them he's God. And he's doing the same thing that God did for Moses and Elijah in the earlier days. Or maybe it's just all miscommunication and we don't know what he was doing any more than the disciples do. The truth is, I don't know. But I know my Jesus loves them. And he's not bypassing them. And he doesn't do that because he doesn't care. And that's the question. It's a question that matters. I may not know why God does what God does. And there's a lot of times I don't. There's a lot of times I sit there as perplexed as you when bad things happen and I want to know where God was in that situation or that story. But I ultimately come to the conclusion that God cares. And God still loves and God still interacts in the world. And that may sound incredibly simple. But I think it's one of the most important questions you will ever have to ask yourself. I think after all the theology I've studied, as far as I can tell, the two questions that seem to matter are, does God actually care? And how active is God in the world? Those are the real questions people really wrestle with in their day-to-day lives. And I think one of the things that set Christianity apart is that we have a loving God who does care. And it's very easy for me to sit in this wonderful church with our wonderful heating system in the winter and say that God cares about us. But when the horrible stuff happens, and most of you know all too well that the horrible stuff does happen, we still answer the same way that God cares, even when we don't understand where God is in the situation. And I hope we do. I hope we have enough evidences of God's love that even when things don't go our way, we'll still say God is good and God loves us. And the reason I can do that is that the whole story testifies to that. God loved the world so much, he sent his only begotten Son. God loved me enough to send Jesus to die for me. And I'd like to think if I was the only sinner that ever was created, God would have still sent Jesus to die for me. That's the gospel story. God does love us. even when it seems like God doesn't, even when it seems like our life's out of control and Jesus just seems to be passing by without a care in the world, without even noticing us. I don't always understand where God is in the story. And as many great theories are on this, I don't totally understand why Jesus' desire is to pass him by. But at the end of the day, I have to conclude that God still loves us and that God has a point to God's actions. And I hope you come to the same conclusion.